Hello friends, this is today's lecture on analysis and critical thinking. Today we're going to dive a little more deeply into the pieces of rhetorical analysis and how that ties in with the critical thinking and critical reading processes that we've been practicing so far this semester. So today for this lecture you may want some note-taking materials, and again, as always, this is really for your own sake because these materials will of course be always available to you, but this is for the purpose of gaining that extra layer of physical involvement in the learning process. As we mentioned before, the rhetorical triangle is important to keep in mind as a mnemonic for all of the pieces of the rhetorical situation. This includes your major rhetorical appeals. This includes kind of the soapstone aspects of a text, as well as giving us a little bit of information about the relationships between each piece of the rhetorical triangle. So in addition to looking at the rhetorical triangle and then in looking at soapstone, which we're going to look at in a separate video, there are several things we can and should examine when we do rhetorical analysis projects. First, rhetorical analysis requires that we read critically and consciously. So the critical and metacognitive skills that we've been practicing will go a long way in helping us do this work. Here are the basic steps of rhetorical analysis. We're going to break this down a little bit, but right now we're just going to focus on the general form that rhetorical analysis should take and how you get from one piece to the next. So the basic steps of doing a rhetorical analysis, this is different from, say, a sample outline of what an analysis paper would look like. This is more the cognitive process that you would take to perform this kind of analysis. You would first retrace the conversation. Now, this means that you would look at the conversation that the writer is participating in, what is the rhetorical situation that they are involved in. This would also include a brief discussion of the author's key claims, as well as perhaps the relevance of the topic itself. This can be a brief exercise because you are essentially summarizing the work and then placing it in a larger context. Number two, you would be responding to the ideas of others. So essentially, you would be helping your readers understand the context in which this writer's ideas would make sense. You are sort of explaining what the writer means to your audience, saying, even if later you disagree with them, here is the part where you would be saying, this seems to be what the author's trying to do, trying to accomplish. You would be discussing the author's goals. Next, you may want to discuss possible implications. So this is where you would put any problems with their text aside. You would simply look at what they say and say, do their claims make sense? Does this claim, when taken to its logical endpoint, still hold up? What are the implications of their arguments? What are the implications of the changes that they're discussing, etc.? You are just taking their argument to the fullness of its logic. Next, you may want to introduce conflicting points of view. Now, this is the part where you would raise possible criticisms to indicate something that the authors may have overlooked, something they may not have explained fully or they may not fully understand. This is where you will do the kind of negative criticism work as opposed to the positive criticism. This is where you would discuss any shortcomings, anything they overlooked, anything where their logic breaks down or their evidence is insufficient. Next, you would formulate your own claim. So once you notice that you don't get to this part until you have done an incredible amount of work just with what the text itself contains. You will formulate your own claim only once you have really chewed over everything that is in the piece you're working with. And finally, as you write, as you construct your analysis, you'll want to ensure that your own purpose will be clear to your audience and that your own evidence and your own argumentation is solid. Okay, so one of the first things that you need to do is to identify the features of the writer's argument. So you need to be able to break down what they're arguing for or against, what they're trying to explain. And we do this by looking at kind of three different things. We look at this by examining how the writer sees the rhetorical situation. We look at the kinds of claims they're making and the types of evidence that they use. So first, when you identify the situation, this is pretty simple. The situation is whatever is moving the author to write, whatever is inspiring them to write or making them feel like they need to respond to something. This is the overall rhetorical situation that this writer is working in. The writer will often reference this situation early in their work, and they will demonstrate they're familiar in this topic. They will situate themselves in a context or a conversation. Now, the urgency of a writer's argument is not always triggered by a single situation or a single cause. It's usually multifaceted, and a good writer will help us see how the situation that they confront is complex, is interconnected. So the writer, this is often something we encounter at the beginning of the work. This is their thesis. This is what they are responding to. And hopefully, if this is a good piece that we are, analyzing and we discover that it's effective, part of that effectiveness will come with the amount of complexity and nuance that they allow into their writing. So, kinds of claims. We need to examine the kind of claim that a writer is making. Claims are the assertions that the writer must justify and support. The thesis of a piece is just the main claim that a writer is making. So in order to judge whether or not the writer was effective in their work, one of the things that you need to do is to find the core of the author's argument. First, obviously, you want to find their thesis. What's their thesis? What are they arguing against or for or about? When they're writing themselves into a academic or political or whatever, when they're writing themselves into a conversation, their thesis is the contribution to that conversation. But you should also pay attention to the minor claims that arise in support of the thesis. These minor claims don't shape the piece overall, but they do still need to be adequately supported with evidence, with evidence. So that part is the bit where we discuss the possible implications and maybe introduce conflicting points of view, because you're looking at the claims and the evidence that they provide, and you are discussing if they are sufficient, if they are complete, if they are nuanced. If they are, wonderful. If they're not, great, you have more stuff to write about. There are three kinds of claims that cover almost every writing situation. There are claims of fact, claims of value, and claims of policy. You could also think of claims of facts as epistemological claims. Epistemology is just the philosophical study of truth, how we know what truth is, how we know what reality is. Well, truth specifically, reality is something different, but how we know if something is true or not. So a claim of fact discusses the truth of a concept or of a phenomenon or of something. A claim of fact might be me trying to say, well, chocolate ice cream objectively tastes better than vanilla ice cream. That's a claim of fact, and it's also one that's going to be hard to back up. A claim of value is an ethical or moral claim. This is where you would say something like, this is bad, this is good, this is worth criticizing, this is a bad thing in society, this is a helpful thing. It's pretty simple. It's just you're making a basic ethical claim about something. And then finally, you have claims of policy. Claims of policy are actionable claims. These are statements that start with phrases like we should, we must, the government ought to, society needs to. It's saying, a claim of policy is saying that the audience needs to take some kind of action or make some kind of change. So to use kind of a more newsworthy, big, large-scale example, we can make each of these kinds of claims about climate change. The claim of fact would be something like, climate change exists. The claim of value would be something like, climate change is bad. And a claim of policy would be like, we must reach zero carbon emissions by 2030 to curb climate change. So then you can see how each of those kind of function in a thesis and in just a brief sentence. So next, You want to identify the writer's audience. What do you know about the writer's audience? This is closely tied to soapstone. Are there certain facts, ideas, or genres that the audience must be familiar with? So because a writer is always writing into a conversation, is there anything that their audience must be able to know or do or access in order for them to understand the material in this piece that you're looking at? Are there, do the authors or do the audience need to, should they be scientists? Do they need to be familiar with analytical essays? Do they need to be familiar with classical philosophy? I don't know. What does the audience need to know? Similarly, what does the writer's language and tone imply about their readers? Does the writer talk down to their readers? Are they really funny? What do those things imply? Likewise, what allusions and references does the author make, and what might that say about the audience? If an author makes a ton of allusions to like Greek mythology or something, what is that saying about the intended audience of the piece? Similarly, what does the structure of the piece imply about the audience, or even the genre of the piece? If something is in a, an English textbook, then that genre would imply that the intended audience needs to have access to that textbook. So this has been a brief overview of some of the pieces of rhetorical analysis and how you can sort of approach this process critically, some of the questions you need to ask yourself, some of the processes that you need to undergo. In our other video for today, we're going to be talking about soapstone. This will be a very short video that will give you another little tool into thinking about how to break down an argument.